That night, the air was sharp with cold. Street lights flickered above the cracked sidewalk. Amanda pulled her coat tighter and stepped past a row of trash bins behind a bakery. Her fingers clenched a crumpled photograph she had carried for years. Her shoes splashed through a shallow puddle as she reached a shadowed corner. There, beneath a torn sleeping bag and cardboard wall, lay a man. Dirty, bearded, unmoving. "Papa?" Her voice trembled. The man stirred. Slowly, his eyes opened. He blinked once, twice. Then came a whisper. "Amanda?" Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful true life stories like this. Your support helps us reach more people with narratives that matter. This story is not just about rising from nothing. It's about the invisible sacrifices, broken systems, and one man's silent promise to a daughter who thought she was alone. Let's take you back to where it all began. Amanda was just 7 when her mother died of cancer. Her father, James, once a street musician, fell apart. First came the drinking, then the pills. But pain made her sharp. Anger made her hungry. She studied harder than anyone. Teachers noticed her. Debating clubs welcomed her. She read books on law and justice, not because they interested her, but because they gave her control. If I can't control who stays in my life, she thought, I'll control what happens next. At 15, she earned a scholarship to a private high school. At 17, she gave a speech that went viral on local news. By 19, she held an acceptance letter from Harvard Law School in trembling hands. But one thing remained unchanged. Her mind floated somewhere between disbelief and fury. She had found him. After more than 10 years of imagining the worst, he was real, alive, but not whole. James had barely spoken. He simply looked at her like he had seen a ghost. Amanda hadn't cried. Not yet. That night, she sat on her bed with her laptop open and a single question pounding in her head. Why had he never come back? The next morning, after hours of searching, Amanda found a number. It belonged to a shelter in the industrial part of the city. She called. "Do you keep long-term resident records?" she asked. "Only by ID or full name," came the reply. "James Ellison." There was a pause. "That name's been here since 2012. Comes and goes. You family?" Amanda's voice cracked. "Yes." The woman on the line added, "He never puts anyone down as emergency contact. He sleeps in the same cot when he's here. Quiet, keeps to himself." Amanda wrote everything down. Then she packed a sandwich, 2 water bottles, and walked 12 blocks through the cold. At the shelter, the woman at the desk led her to the back. "He's in the yard, fixing the fence. We let some of the regulars do maintenance work for food credits. I couldn't give you much, but I could give you that." She stared at the paper, then at him. For the first time, she didn't see a failure. She saw a man who had lost everything, except the instinct to love his child. 2 days later, Amanda returned to the shelter with a warmer coat, a pair of gloves, and a bag of groceries. She didn't ask if her father wanted help. She just offered it. James didn't say much. He accepted the gloves with a quiet "thank you" and set them on the bench beside him. His hands, rough and cracked, looked like they hadn't known warmth in years. Inside the shelter, Amanda noticed something strange. In the far corner, behind the cafeteria tables, stood an old upright piano. Its wood was chipped. One leg was braced with bricks, but it stood proudly like it belonged. James followed her gaze. "Still works?" he muttered. "Sometimes, at night, when everyone's asleep." She turned to him. You still remember how? James chuckled. Some things never leave your fingers, no matter how far your life goes. He sat down on the bench, cracked his knuckles, and laid his fingers on the keys. The memory was too clear, too close. You always had this way of making people listen, he said. Even when you were a little kid. I knew then you'd grow up and say something the world needed to hear. Amanda looked at him. I used to hate you. I mean, really hate you. James nodded. You had every right to. But now, she paused, I'm just trying to understand how you kept loving me while staying so far away. He looked down. Shame is heavy, and love, it doesn't always know how to carry it. Amanda sat beside him on the bench. The two of them, silent, next to a piano with missing keys and untuned strings. Yet in that imperfect place, they found something rare. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. That the past, broken as it was, still held moments worth remembering. The months passed quietly. Amanda balanced her final year at Harvard Law with short weekend trips to the city. She never told her professors, classmates, or roommates where she went. It wasn't something she could explain in passing conversation. Some visits were short, others stretched for hours. Sometimes she brought books, other times just coffee. But slowly, the silence between her and James began to soften. One Sunday, she found him fixing a broken door hinge at the shelter. You could get paid for this, you know, Amanda joked. I don't do it for money, he said. I do it so I feel like I still exist. She didn't laugh, because she understood. The world had a way of making people like him invisible. Back at Harvard, emails about graduation came pouring in. Cap and gown rentals, guest passes, ceremony tickets. Amanda sat staring at the RSVP form for hours. There was only one name she wanted to write. But what if he didn't come? What if he showed up looking like he did that first night? What if he embarrassed her? The shame creeped in like an old friend, and with it, guilt. That week, during their usual meeting, she folded the invitation into a thin envelope and slid it across the table. It's next month, she said, not meeting his eyes. You don't have to come, but I wanted you to have it. James took the envelope with both hands. He nodded. No promises. The day of graduation arrived with clear skies and heavy nerves. Amanda stood in her robe, heart pounding behind her ribs as her name was called. The applause was loud, the lights blinding. She searched the crowd. Dozens of faces, some smiling, some clapping. But the chair she had reserved in the back row was empty. Still, she walked forward, held her diploma, took the photo, delivered her speech. It was only after the ceremony, when the crowd had thinned and the sun began to fall, that she found something taped to the back of the empty chair. A note, in familiar handwriting. I couldn't walk in with everyone else. I stood at the edge. I saw you. I heard every word. You made it, Amanda, and I'm proud of you in ways words can't hold. Underneath it, a photo. One she hadn't seen in years. It was her, 6 years old, sitting on his lap, hands over his on the piano keys. Amanda held the note to her chest, eyes closed, as the city faded behind her. He hadn't stayed, but he had shown up. Back in her small apartment in Cambridge, Amanda placed the old photo and the note into a wooden box she kept under her bed. It was the same box where she stored every acceptance letter, every childhood drawing, and a crumpled flyer for a missing person, her father's, printed in black and white years ago. She sat on the floor, pulled out a blank piece of paper, and began to write. Dear Dad, I don't know what I want to say, really. Maybe that I'm sorry, or maybe that I still don't know how to forgive you. But I do know this. I don't want to lose you again." She paused, crumpled the letter, started over. "Dear James, that feels too cold. Dear Papa, too soft." She left the paper blank. Instead, she grabbed her phone and sent a simple message. "I want to understand you. Tell me where to start." A day passed, then two. On the third day, his reply came in a photo. It was an alley, one she vaguely recognized. Then a message. "This is where I hit rock bottom." Amanda stared at the image. She knew that alley. It was near a library she used to visit as a teen. They had once walked the same streets, just years apart, worlds away. The next weekend, she met him at the spot. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at a wall stained with old graffiti. "I was here the night I thought of ending it," he said, voice low. "I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I hadn't spoken to another human in 3. I sat right there," he pointed to a wet crate, "and thought about how quiet it would be." Amanda didn't interrupt. But then, he continued, "A kid from the bakery tossed out a sandwich. Turkey, still warm. I took it as a sign that maybe the world hadn't forgotten me completely." He turned to her. "You want to understand me, Amanda? Then you have to know. Survival looks different when you're on the edge." They walked together for hours after that. He turned to her, his eyes reflecting a mixture of weariness and determination. "You want to understand me, Amanda? Then you have to know. Survival looks different when you're on the edge." Those words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as they began to walk side by side through the fading light of the afternoon. They moved through the streets he had once called home, each step tracing memories both painful and profound. But instead of drafting another letter, she began a new file. She titled it The Invisible: Stories from the Other Side of Rock Bottom. What started as her capstone thesis evolved into something far more significant. It became their story, a narrative long silenced, but now finally being told. 3 months later, Amanda stood backstage at a conference hall in Washington, D.C. The event was called Voices from the Margins, a national policy summit on homelessness, addiction, and justice reform. Amanda had been invited to speak, not just as a Harvard Law graduate, but as someone who had lived the invisible cost of systems that fail. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the mic clipped to her collar. The moderator's voice rang out. "Our next speaker brings a story not from a textbook, but from her own life. Please welcome Amanda Ellison." Applause rose as she walked to the podium. She paused for a breath, then began. "People like to ask me how I went from foster care to Harvard, but no one ever asks what it cost me to get here. The answer is simple. It cost me my father." The room stilled. "My dad was a musician. Not famous, just one of those men who could make a broken song feel whole. He also battled addiction. He lost his job, our home, my trust, and eventually his place in my life." She paused again, scanning the audience. Dozens of faces, some leaning forward, some wide-eyed. But here's what no one tells you. Broken people don't stop loving you. They just don't know how to show up for you while holding their own shame. She told them about the photo, the piano, the note taped to the empty chair, the turkey sandwich in the alley that kept him alive. And then she said, "Justice isn't just about punishing those who fall. It's about asking why they fell And who was watching? A long silence followed her last sentence. Then came the applause. But what Amanda didn't expect was what happened after. A woman from a nonprofit approached her. "We want to help publish your thesis. It could change how people see homelessness." A professor from another law school offered her a guest lecturer spot. But most unexpected of all, James was there. He hadn't told her he'd come. He stood at the back of the room, wearing a borrowed jacket and clean jeans, clutching a coffee like it was gold. His eyes were red, but he was smiling. Later, outside the hall, Amanda walked up to him. "You came," she said. He shrugged. "Didn't want to miss your debut as a revolution starter. You proud?" He looked at her for a moment. Proud doesn't cover it. Something had shifted between him and Amanda. Something quiet but strong. They now spoke like two people who understood that time couldn't be rewritten, only repurposed. A week later, Amanda booked a room at a small transitional housing center in South Boston. The walls were beige. The view was of an alley, but it was warm, clean, safe. Room 302. She met him outside the shelter at dawn. He had his few belongings in a duffel bag and an old harmonica in his coat pocket. "This place," she said, handing him the key card, "isn't much, but it's yours for the next 6 months." Every Sunday, she visited, sometimes with soup, sometimes with books, sometimes with nothing but time. One evening, she brought him a used keyboard. James's eyes lit up. "Found it at a church auction," she said, setting it up on the desk. He played for hours that night, not just the lullabies, but jazz, gospel, a little Beethoven. One day, Amanda arrived and found a handwritten note taped to the door. "Gone to interview, back by noon. Wish me luck, Jay." He got the job. It wasn't much, just restocking shelves at a corner market, but it was honest and it gave him structure. "It feels good to have a reason to wake up," he told her. "Besides seeing you, I mean." Amanda smiled. She didn't say it, but he had already become part of her daily rhythm. A heartbeat she didn't realize she needed until it returned. But healing wasn't linear. One Friday, he missed their call, then another. On Sunday, his phone went straight to voicemail. Amanda's chest tightened as she stood in front of room 302, knocking. No answer. She found the staff. They opened the door. The room was empty, immaculate. The keyboard still sat on the desk. But James was gone. No note, no warning, just silence. Amanda stood there, eyes scanning the space as dread bloomed in her throat. Had he relapsed? Run? Disappeared again? Her hands shook. She dropped into the chair by the keyboard and pressed a key. The note echoed through the room like a question with no answer. And then she saw it, tucked inside the bench, a sealed envelope. Her name on it. Now, she stared at the envelope like it might vanish if she blinked. Her fingers hovered for a moment before tearing the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. No stains, no creases. She unfolded it. "Amanda, if you're reading this, I didn't disappear. I left, but this time not to escape. This time it was a step forward. There's a program up north, a halfway house with music therapy. They offered me a bed, a keyboard, and a second chance. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to talk me out of it, or into it. I wanted to choose it myself. I know I've left a trail of broken promises. I know words feel cheap coming from me. But I'm hoping this time my actions can speak louder. Room 302 was a gift. Not just the bed or the roof. The chance, the dignity. You gave that to me. You gave me something I thought I'd lost the right to have. I don't expect a parade or a reunion. Just know this, I'm trying. Every single day. And Amanda, I'm proud of you. Not just for Harvard, not for the speeches or the interviews. I'm proud of the person you chose to be in a world that gave you every excuse not to care. You're the kind of woman your mother dreamed of, and I'm honored to be your father, even if it took me a lifetime to grow into that role. If you ever want to visit, ask the front desk at Harmony House, room 5. I'll keep the light on. Love always. Amanda folded the letter slowly, hands trembling. She pressed it to her lips and sat in the quiet. She didn't cry. She just sat there, breathing in the silence he had left behind. Not the kind filled with abandonment, but the kind that makes space for possibility. She left room 302 that evening, carrying the letter in her coat pocket like a compass. At home, she opened her laptop and renamed the document she had been writing. From the invisible to the return. It wasn't a story about saving someone. It was a story about seeing them. 2 weeks later, Amanda stood outside Harmony House. It was an old Victorian-style home turned recovery center on the outskirts of a sleepy town in Vermont. The paint was peeling. The sign out front leaned slightly to the left, but the garden was freshly trimmed, and the windows glowed with soft amber light. She didn't call ahead. She didn't want to give herself time to back out. At the front desk, the woman smiled and nodded when Amanda asked for room 5. "He's in the back," she said. "We just finished music circle. He's usually the last to leave." Amanda walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking with each step. She paused at the doorway and peeked inside. James sat alone at the piano, head bowed, fingers gliding over the keys like they were telling a story his voice couldn't. She waited until the melody faded before stepping in. He looked up. For a second, neither of them said a word. Then he stood. "You came," he said softly. "I read your letter," Amanda replied. "Twice." James smiled, nervous, hopeful. They sat in silence for a moment before Amanda said, "Can you teach me that song?" He blinked. "What, this old thing?" "Yeah, I want to learn." Instead, she opened her notebook and read aloud a paragraph from her manuscript. He listened carefully. When she finished, he leaned back and said, "You found the words I never could." Amanda looked at him. Maybe we both did. As night settled outside, the sound of imperfect piano notes floated from room 5, echoing through the hallways like a hymn no one remembered how to sing, but somehow still recognized. A year later, Amanda stood on the stage of a packed auditorium in New York City. The event was a national summit on justice reform, but this time, she wasn't just a speaker. She was the keynote. Her book, The Return, had just made the national bestseller list. It wasn't a memoir in the traditional sense. It was a mirror, a reflection of a fractured bond slowly being mended, not with miracles, but with time, grace, and radical honesty. Backstage, she glanced down at her phone. A new message. From Dad. Front row, left side, green flannel. "You'll probably pretend not to see me." She smiled. Amanda walked onto the stage, calm and grounded. The applause rolled in like a soft wave. She opened her speech not with statistics or legal reform ideas, but with a story. "My father taught me how to play piano. He also taught me how people disappear without ever leaving. He was my first heartbreak and my greatest proof that people can change." She paused. "But not everyone gets a second chance, and almost no one gets someone who waits long enough to offer it." Then she stepped back and gestured to a piano placed to the side. "This next part isn't in the program, but it's in my story." The lights dimmed slightly. Amanda sat at the piano, and her father walked on stage to join her. The audience gasped, not because they recognized him, but because they felt something unspoken pass between them. He nodded once, she nodded back. Together they began to play. It wasn't perfect. The rhythm slipped here and there, but no one in the audience noticed, because the room was filled with something more powerful than precision: forgiveness. When they finished, the applause erupted. But James didn't bow. He simply took her hand, held it tight, and whispered, "We made it." Afterward, they sat in the wings, away from the lights and noise. "You were always the brave one," he said. "No," Amanda replied, eyes glistening. "I just never stopped hoping." Outside, the city buzzed. Another night, another crowd. But inside that room, time felt paused, like the universe had taken one small breath just for them. And from that moment on, Amanda knew. Some stories don't end with answers, they end with connection. Sometimes, healing begins when we stop chasing perfection and start honoring progress. Love doesn't always arrive dressed in triumph. Sometimes, it walks in quietly, scarred but whole, asking only to be seen and to be heard.